Let's jump in. So I'm Alex. I run Silverwood, which is an advising and consulting business. We work with founders generally, and sometimes sales leaders and marketing leaders to help with everything from go-to-market to M&A and strategy. I advise founders through a coaching advising relationship and also jump in rarely to be a fractional CRO or CMO type person. Skip is a company that I founded recently with my friend Julian. Skip is a way to get more customers. We have figured out how to do email or outbound email and other channels with AI in a way that doesn't sound like AI and keeps the human in the loop. So it's our twist on the AI SDR thing, which is very different, much more effective, but a totally different way to do it. Happy to talk to anybody about that later. We partnered for the SF Tech Week with IPG, Innovation Properties Group. They're great representatives for startups looking for office space. I've worked with them a bunch and can't say enough good things. So if anybody needs office space, they're a great resource. A little bit about me. I started Skip recently. It's not my first startup. I've started several, led an acquisition M&A process a couple times for one of them. Before that, ran acquisitions at Open Door as head of corp dev. Bought a bunch of companies, spent nine figures. A lot of that knowledge is going to be in this deck. But I think what's important is I've also been an employee through acquisitions. I've been a founder running those acquisition talks. I've also been on the other side of the table. So I have a lot of different insights on how the process works that any one of those roles wouldn't have. I've also, I should mention, been an investor in companies that have been acquired and played a role in that and advised companies that were acquired. So kind of every possible angle on the acquisition. I run a newsletter called Seed to Sequoia. If you Google it, it should come up. It is a newsletter for founders on strategy and go-to-market. We touch on M&A. It's a resource that's also open to you. You may already be getting it, and if you are, thank you and welcome. Selling your startup is challenging. A lot of people think you read TechCrunch, it's the sort of thing you can stay at a Holiday Inn Express and the next morning wake up and run a great process. And it's just not that easy. And so the point of this deck and this presentation is really to give you a sense for what's involved in getting acquired. So when I say selling your startup, really somebody's buying your startup. Today, we're going to talk about the whole process, start to finish, so you can walk away knowing, hey, this is where I am. If you're in a process, this is where I want to be. How do I set myself up for it? We're going to learn tactics that you could probably apply right now to set yourself up for acquisition. And then I'm going to go through a bunch of examples throughout that gives you a sense for the pattern recognition and pattern matching of, oh, this happened. It feels a little bit like that. And this is how that could turn out. And at the end, we'll do Q&A. And I always send out a feedback survey. I really appreciate any feedback people give just because it gives me a better sense for what worked and what didn't work. One of the big things in the feedback this time, because it was a kind of abbreviated in-person run through, was more examples. So I'm going to try and work in more examples as we talk through this. Three big ideas. I can't say these things enough. The first one is that building a great business is the winning strategy. We read a lot about companies that got acquired that never generated revenue, or there was a Windsurf acquisition recently where 3 billion went for IP and the founders. And the reality is, if you build a great business, you have a lot more options. That's the only way to ensure a great outcome. Great partnerships are your best tactics. When we talk about how to drive a process, how to get a process started, how to drive a process, partnerships are the way. And we're going to talk a lot about how to set that up and how to take advantage of that. Finally, taking smart risks is important, right? We're running startups. It's not that you should run your startup risk-free, but there are dumb risks you can avoid. And we're going to talk about those risks that can kill your startup and kill your M&A deal even before you even get there. It might be dead on arrival. We're going to talk about all these things. And I really hope that some of it at least sinks in. The first and most important thing, just to set the stage, is that you're not your company. A lot of founders, myself included, really tied their personal success and personal worth to their company. And the reality is that that's just unhealthy and it's not productive. What's best for you or what's best for your company may not be the same thing. And if you get your ego tied too much into your company and that becoming your professional or personal identity, it can be really risky. Yes, we all prefer that our companies be successful, but startups are a bet, right? And if you made a bet and the market didn't turn out the way you expected it to, or anybody expected it to, it's fine to move on. Shutting down is a thing, and there's nothing wrong, nothing fundamentally wrong with it. Let's start at the end. What is the end game? Let's say you are successful or moderately successful in building a company. What happens in the closing moments? So I think I'd start with asking, what is your exit goal? Trying to create generational wealth? Are you trying to get acqui-hired? Different people have different goals and different things that they're optimizing for here. I think that to achieve any goal, you want this scenario to play out. You want to get at least one unsolicited offer. You want to get other offers that you can then negotiate either the first offer or the other offers. Ideally, end up with three offers or more, but more than five is actually counterproductive. Less than three becomes suboptimal, and one is still, it only takes one to sell your company, but one doesn't give you a lot of negotiating leverage. You then sign an LOI, and which is not a given, even from the LOI standpoint. You could 50-50 chance of not actually closing. So that's the ideal scenario in the end. You drive off happily ever after. How do you do that though? What are the tactics? What are the things that get you to that point? So the companies that are most likely to succeed there are profitable, or at least running a break even. They're growing, the more the better. They run a competitive process. And you can succeed with only one of these, right? If you're profitable, private equity will buy you if you're very profitable. If you're growing but losing money, you can get acquired by a large company, by a strategic, not by private equity, maybe by another startup in a merger, but you have options. If you have neither of those things, but a bunch of people want to buy you, let's say you've built a great technology and you haven't brought it to market. Siri's a good example of this. Siri wasn't profitable at all, but Apple bought them for 100 million because Apple saw a purpose in acquiring that technology. There are a bunch of examples of this, but you can run a competitive process usually because you've built something in your product or you've assembled a great team that drives a great outcome without being profitable or growing. But the more of these you have, the better. And I'll say in this market, unless you have insane growth, unless you're a base 44, some hyper growth AI company, you're not going to succeed in running a process if you're not at least to break even or very close, because every $1 million that you burn is another $1 million on the purchase price that your acquirer is not going to be able to stomach in the current M&A environment. So these are your levers. The thing that I think is really important is why they're such good levers, right? Profitability means you don't have to sell, right? You can just keep running the business. Growth means if you don't buy me now, I'm going to cost more, maybe 10x more 6 months or 12 months from now, right? So, and then obviously the competitive process, if you build something of value, there's the fear of missing out for your acquirer and for your competitors, right? So that drives that competitive process, or their competitors. I think the growth one is a key one. So a friend of mine sold this company to Airbnb, and every time they met every 6 to 12 months at different conferences. They had added a few million in revenue, right? To a point where it was starting to go exponential. And so at first it was like, oh, this idea is cute. You guys seem to be doing great. Keep in touch. And by the third or fourth meeting, it was like, oh shit, you're at 10 million in revenue. Like you're at 25. Like we can't afford not to buy you because you're starting to actually take a significant chunk of our market, and this is only going to get more expensive later on. So I think that if you can, they weren't profitable. It wasn't really a competitive process. It was just that one acquirer really valued it, saw the growth, and was able to pay up for that. So what is the process? People talk about a process, running a process. What does that mean? The process starts, it's a journey and it takes a lot of time. So let's just go through what that road looks like. You start, maybe somebody sends you an unsolicited offer. Maybe they say, hey, look, we're thinking about buying. Can we talk? But you start with this. You decide, hey, we're going to pursue a sale. We're going to actually think about this, take this offer seriously, hear them out. Over the first couple weeks, up to 6 months, you get your first LOI. So how could it be 6 months? If you say, hey, look, we're out of runway in 12 months and we need to start raising money now, we need to do something about that now. That's when it takes at least 6 months, possibly quite a bit longer. But if you had somebody send you an offer unsolicited and it's a good offer and you would take it, you can have other offers, and you could have that LOI in a couple of weeks and you could have other offers really quickly. I read recently that some deals are getting done in a couple of days. I think the Windsurf deal, Google closed that in a couple of days once they finally got around to figuring out a structure that worked. It really varies, but once you get that first LOI, you negotiate it in most cases, and you have 4 to 6 weeks to shop for more LOIs. So that doesn't mean you get the LOI and you start shopping. As soon as you get wind of an acquisition, somebody says, hey, we're thinking about making an offer. It isn't like the LOI just shows up out of the blue. You have a couple conversations. That's the point where you go tell other people that you have relationships with, or possibly retain a banker and they have relationships with, hey, we're expecting an LOI. Is this something you'd be interested in? I'd like to work with you, but things are moving pretty quickly. Over 4 to 6 weeks, you shop for and negotiate those LOIs. You do management presentations for 2 of those weeks. Management presentation is when you go in for 90 minutes and pitch the deck that you shared in a data room or something like that with those potential acquirers. You get a chance to meet their management, they get a chance to meet you. That process takes a couple weeks. Some of them will have run light diligence. So this is depends on how quickly that first mover was moving, but typically you're dragging your feet. So you're in the process of getting more LOIs here. You're doing what you need to get the LOIs, the management presentations, the light diligence. It's unlikely you can drag an LOI out for a month or two once they've actually written it. People get sort of annoyed and think about it like a job offer in a way, right? If you get a job offer and say, let me think about it for a couple months and keep on dragging your feet, eventually people are going to say, hey, look, they don't really want to work here. They're not really interested. We're wasting our. Depends on the leverage you have, where you are as a business. In an acqui-hire, it would be a really bad look. In a more competitive deal, it might be fine. You do management presentations, you do diligence, and get those LOIs. So that's one or more LOIs, which you negotiate. Eventually, you sign one of them. That'll usually almost always have an exclusivity provision, which means you can't talk to the other people anymore. You chose your horse. That's the horse you've chosen, and that's it. So super important at this point to negotiate everything you want in that LOI, because if it isn't in there, it's probably not going to go your way. You lose all of your leverage at this point because now you're sort of tied to this one horse. They will do confirmatory diligence. At the same time, you'll negotiate definitive agreements over the next anywhere from days to year. You'll get approvals and closing. So those approvals are from shareholders, depending on the terms of the deal, possibly employees or other stakeholders. If you have commercial agreements that require approval on a change in control, those would be triggered. You need to get those approvals. They also include regulatory approvals. You can definitely kill deals. And so, you need to be mindful of regulatory approvals, and that's what can take a year. The other approvals typically don't. I've seen public company, if you have a lot of small shareholders, it might take months to get all a 50+% shareholder approval vote done, because if everybody has, really small holdings and doesn't really care, then that can be time consuming. But really the long pole is regulators if you have them. And at this point, you would have signed deal docs, everything would be done. You'd just be waiting for that approval. But the wire wouldn't hit until you got it. That was a lot. Price, there's everybody fixates on price. The price is only one term. There are a lot of other really important terms. I'm not going to go through each one of them now, but just be aware when you enter this process that price is one among many things. I don't even know if it's the most important. For starters, they might not even, the price may be a fictional number because it's private company stock. So you said you got bought for 10 million, but really like it was funny money. It would be valuation of a company that's maybe down since then, what that's worth versus cash, which is obviously worth something, or public company stock, which is obviously worth something. So type of payment matters, the timing of those payments, how long you have to stick around, what else can you do? So many different things that are part of this. It's important to not fixate entirely on price. We talked about the drive off into the sunset scenario, but what if you're not doing so good, right? How do you run an acquisition process if you're down to your last 6 or 12 months of runway, you're not growing, you're maybe not profitable? What do you do then? The unhappy path is still similar to the happy path. You just have a lot less leverage. So you need 4 to 6 months at a minimum to sell. What does that mean? If this is you and you have 4 to 6 months right now and you need to go, just sell. Don't pretend that building the next product or raising the next round is the future. Focus on selling, running that process. If you have 4 months and you are running a money losing business, cut some costs to get 6. If you cut costs at 4 months, you might buy yourself another 2 months. If you wait till you're down to 2 months, the same cuts will get you 2 weeks. So make sure that you get ahead of this and really buy yourself the time you need to run a process. You can do an acqui-hire in a couple months, but it's hard to give yourself more time. You can even do it in a couple weeks, but it's not going to be pleasant, and it's not going to be nearly as good of an outcome as if you gave yourself a couple months, or even better, 6. Well, a lot of people miss out on, and this goes back to that you're not your company point. Shutting down is fine, right? And it actually, in an acqui-hire process, it can be a great alternative as leverage, because if that company really does want your IP or really does want your team, saying, hey, look, if we don't get an offer in 2 weeks, we're shutting down. We're going to start the shutdown process, and that's it. that'll make people get off the couch and actually go make a decision. Whereas if they think they can just wait, they might just keep waiting, and then that puts you in a really difficult spot. So be honest with yourself. There are new ways to shut down. There used to be really used to cost $100,000 and be, heavily lawyered. There's simple closure. Tori's done a great job of making that a much less expensive process that you don't have to stress about as much. But what that means is you can maybe buy yourself another month. If your burn's 100K, you can get one more month in. Be honest with yourself. Get good advice. Again, you're not your company. Who are the buyers? I think this is the thing that really shocks a lot of founders when they get into what is really behind the curtain, who really is buying companies. I'm not going to go through this in super detail, but basically you have strategics, and those are the people that pay the most. Those are, the Googles, the Salesforces, people that say, hey, if I take your product and sell it to my 500,000 customers, I'm going to make billions of dollars. So those are the ones that are going to pay the bigger premium. They're going to be able to quote unquote buy the model, which is, oh, if we get $500 times 500,000 customers, this is worth billions, right? Those are your ideal buyer in almost every scenario. Private equity acquirers, however, are looking for businesses and they're buying all the time. They tend to be more price sensitive because they're trying to drive returns, but they're not as fear motivated, right? If Google and Microsoft are competing to buy a company, right, they might really not want their competitor to have it. Whereas PE isn't going to pay 3x more than the thing is worth just to keep it out of somebody else's hands. They're a little bit more disciplined when it comes to price, but they are actively buying companies. That is what they exist to do. And so they might precipitate an acquisition where a strategic might just take a wait and see approach. This is playing out right now with one of my advisees. They had a PE shop that was interested in making an acquisition offer, and they reached out to a strategic and they were like, oh shit, we got to make a choice. And that got the strategic off the bench and into the game. It's important to understand their rationales and their motivations, but they're both important players. Who are the best buyers? The best buyers are public companies. Specifically, the human that's buying you is somebody who owns a profit and loss statement. So a VP or GM of a business unit, sometimes a chief product officer, depending on how the companies are arranged. And if it's a bigger deal or the company's on the smaller side, which again, if it's a public company, it's the CEO. I talked to the head of corporate Salesforce, and half of the deals he works on are because Mark decided he wanted to buy the company. So if it's a company, they're going to buy the company. They'll negotiate on price and they'll drive a good deal, but ultimately, that's a great buyer for you to have as a startup. The same thing is somewhat true of bigger private companies. The bigger, the better, because they have more cash, they have lower cost of capital, right? Getting bought by a SpaceX or somebody of that size is way better than being bought by a Series B company with 13 million in the bank or 13 million raised, 5 left or something. In a big private company, again, it's great to have a relationship with the CEO or the founder. Chief product officer is also great. But we'll get into it, but other roles are not going to drive the same kind of process for you. Let's talk about those other roles. Corporate development is who a lot of people think buy companies. And they do. Google has an email address you can send your deck to if you're getting hired, and Corp Dev will take a look at it and usually pass, but they'll see a lot of deals and they'll definitely take a look. Salesforce has a great Corp Dev team. All these sort of bigger companies that are actively acquiring companies have Corp Dev teams. The Corp Dev people are a little bit different. They care a lot more about metrics. They paid to get great deals, but that's part of the job, is not overpaying. They are bankers, so they need to value it. They value it the way bankers do, which is putting a multiple on something, revenue, EBIT, EBITDA. So there's got to be something to put a multiple on. So if you're a tech company with 0 customers and $500 in revenue, right, and you want to get bought for $100 million, it's going to be, the corp dev people are going to be like, wait a minute, but why, right? Like what are we valuing here? And the other thing that's crucial about them, which is very different than your Series A or seed investors, is they expect everything to be buttoned up. Your accounting, your forecasts, right? You can't have a deck with one forecast and an Excel spreadsheet with a different forecast. They expect everything to be buttoned up. They've seen hundreds of companies, and they're not interested in wiring tens of millions of dollars to people that don't, where they have questions or concerns. So that's the kind of person you're dealing with, at least on the day-to-day of your deal. Again, I mentioned this, the price is only one of many key terms. Let's talk about buyer quality specifically. So some buyers are way better than other buyers. So I think It's one thing to say, oh, they raised a Series B, it's $40 million. Of course they have cash. Maybe not. Maybe they're burning 3 million a month and they need that to pay their own burn and they don't have any extra cash, right? The bank might not lend a company like that money to do an acquisition, or a credit facility might not exist for that company just because, especially if you're also losing money, right? It's like, great, we went from burning 3 million to burning 4 million, and sure, our revenue went up a little bit, but do they have the cash is critical. What has happened with prior transactions, right? Talk to the founders of companies they've bought in the past, who are usually employees of those companies or ex-employees, find out what happened. Because a lot of people will tell you things and they turn out not to be true. Corp dev will say, oh, it's great, you'll get to run your own business unit, you have the resources to get your earnout, we're not going to mess with your roadmap, right? And then you show up and 2 weeks later, it's like, yeah, we're firing your team, you don't get any resources, you're going to go work over here now. Really find out what they're actually like in the experience of prior founders. Advisors are great because they know these people, whether it's an advisor like me, whether it's a banker. A lot of the times they'll already have a relationship, or they'll have relationships with people that know what happened, and you'll get more real talk from them than you will from the potential buyer. And they have seen patterns over time, and even if they haven't dealt with that company, they can tell you, hey, usually when these things happen in the LOI stage, things go badly later, and you can make more informed choices. Obviously, if just working with them isn't enough, you also have to listen to what they say and take their advice to heart. And then a lot of this can be dealt with in the deal docs. Working with good lawyers is really important. Again, I go back to something I mentioned before. If you're trying to protect against things that buyers do, deal with it at the LOI stage, not later when you don't have leverage. That was all great. It'd be great to be negotiating a bunch of LOIs. It'd be great to be talking to corp dev people about how to allocate the tens of millions in retention across my team. But how do I actually get a deal going? How do I get started? First, you need to have decent metrics, right? These metrics are the same that they are for building your business. They're the same you go out and pitch to VCs, although people care about them differently in the M&A world. But their revenue, their profitability, your sales cycle, that's how you work, NRR, CAC for everybody, but especially if you're product-led growth, those are super important. Your growth rate. There are other ones. I'm not going to list every single metric a business can take care about, but these are the 5 that if I were looking at your company, I would care the most about. The earlier stage you are, the more it might be about potential, right? Like that you've built a great product, that customers really like it, that your CSAT scores are super high or whatever. But those are all nice stories. If you want to get, 9, 10-figure acquisition deals, you need the metrics on some level. The story will only get you so far. And by the way, yes, people get lucky all the time. That's probably not going to be you. There are deals that are done for hundreds of millions or billions that don't have metrics, but better to have the metrics and tell a great story. Your ideal scenario, like we said earlier, is an inbound offer. So companies are bought, not sold. So if you go around and say, hey, we're selling our company, you're not going to get many offers. I mean, depends, right? If you're throwing off 10 million in profit, you might, but you will. But you're going to drive a better deal if somebody comes to you and says, hey, I want to buy your company. And by the way, that isn't like one of those cold emails you get from some random fund in Texas, right? That's looking to roll up startups. Those people are not great buyers. These are, if you're trying to drive an inbound offer that's meaningful, that you care about, that's material, you want somebody who knows you well and is motivated to buy it, right? And so again, private equity, like credible private equity is great, but they only buy real businesses. Strategics are the ones that are really going to drive the most valuation, the best terms, et cetera. So how do you start that? How do you get a deal going? So first, outside in. The best is somebody reaches out and says, hey, we've been following you for a while. We've been working together for a while. Why don't we merge, right? Can we make an offer? Or would you be open to a merger, right? And so that is the best because you know them, they know you. You obviously have some business together and an ongoing partnership. So there's a bunch of insights, the team that's going to move. It's going to move as quick as you want, maybe quicker, but you're going to also have the most control over it because you have that existing relationship. So if you need to pump the brakes a little bit so that you can get another competing offer, you can do that. Those are the best. Another one is somebody else that you don't partner with reaches out. We've been following you. Maybe you met at a conference a couple times and we've come up with a strategy and you would be a great fit for our strategy. Can we have a conversation? So those are also great. Those can happen because you partnered with a competitor of theirs and they're like, oh, wait, we saw that you partnered with A Corp and we're B Corp and we compete with them. Can we take the toy away from A Corp sandbox and have it for ourselves. So that's also a thing that happens. I mentioned before, a PE firm can reach out. They're, they have their own reasons for making acquisitions. One of my favorites is somebody brings in management consultants. This has actually happened to a company I worked with, where a public company brought in McKinsey to look at a new market. McKinsey said, you should buy these guys. And they showed up on the doorstep with their checkbook out. You know, how much does it cost to buy you guys? McKinsey sent us. They didn't say that up front, but it came out during the diligence period. But it happens. And so having a good relationship, having a high profile in your industry can really help, because that only happens if McKinsey and others have heard of you. So the harder thing to do is to start a process inside out. So that's you going out and getting people to make an offer. So the best way to do that is if you're raising a round, especially if you're working with bankers, you can run what's called a parallel process, where you're pitching people, hey, pitching strategics, about 20% of my company in our Series C, right? But if they're like, hey, we'd rather just buy the whole thing, okay, we're listening, right? So that's kind of the best and only high leverage way, in my opinion, to drive a good outcome when you're doing it inside out. You can again engage a banker who runs a process. You know, you need metrics here. Bankers don't work with companies that aren't doing well, or if they do, they only do that when they know they have a buyer, and bankers cost a lot, so there's that to consider. And then the third option is you're running out of money, you need to sell, which I addressed elsewhere, and I've written articles about it. I'm happy to share, but that one is more straightforward. Hey, we're going to run out of money in 2 months. Do you want to bring on the team or not? That doesn't work. Inside out really works, because investment makers can't sell something nobody wants. So most people, what they do, and there's tons of stories about this, they're raising money, they got their Series B, they keep growing, they get their Series C, they keep growing, everything's great, and then growth flatlines, and they can't raise their Series D, right? And they're losing money every month. So they're like, oh, we raised enough for 24 months of runway, but it turns out that when growth flatlines, but your expenses stay the same, you're actually, your runway shrinks. So now what you thought was 24 months, 4 months have gone by, but you missed your numbers. And so now you only have 12 months of runway, right? And so I think what happens is, because you're like, oh, why would I sell? We're going to go raise a Series C, at 500 million or $1 billion. That's great. But when growth slows down, you're going out to sell and you don't have the growth rate that drove that valuation, right? Now you have this huge overhang of the valuation, but you don't have the growth. And so now you're going out and you're trying to sell a company that isn't growing, that isn't profitable. And so, you run into these situations where investment bankers won't even work with you, because they're like, we don't want to piss off Andreessen or Sequoia, because, we want them to work with us on future bigger deals, and they're going to have to take a haircut, or they're going to have to, agree to take a loss. And, it's just an awkward conversation. We'd rather not deal with it. So, even if you raise $200 million or $100 million, you might not be able to get what you want out of it. You might not even be able to retain an investment banker necessarily. Like I said, it's very hard to sell when you're out of runway for two reasons. One, I mentioned this in the live presentation, you end up with this thing called fraudulent conveyance, where there's a little bit more litigation risk to a buyer if you're insolvent. And so a lot of people don't care, but some people do. So that's a consideration. The bigger issue is that everybody knows you're going under. And so they'll just wait, right? Why would I pay 100 million for this asset right now when I could wait 3 months until you don't raise your round and pick it up for 5? I'd be doing everybody a favor. So and if you think you can hide that, you can't, because you're going to tell everybody everything in diligence anyway, so they're going to find out. So if you're looking for unsolicited acquirers, we've talked about this a bunch, partners are your best option. So this is a tactic that you can take advantage of. You can choose partnerships that are mutually beneficial with companies that are bigger. You can keep an eye on the tone of that partnership. Partners that are easy to work with or good to work with are probably going to be good acquirers. Partners that are really difficult and selfish and have difficult leadership or move their strategy around a lot, that's going to also play out in your acquisition process. So be advised that that's a thing. I think it's better to have 3 or 4 really great partners where you're sending each other a lot of business or are deeply integrated, than a lot of really weak small partners where nobody really cares, right? Those companies aren't going to be there if you do run out of runway to acquire you, and they're not going to get super excited about this 2% of their revenue side business that they've got with you, right? But somebody that if you look at, it hasn't happened and I don't think it will, but Bolt sends a ton of business to Netlify, right? Everybody who signs up for a Bolt account ends up with a Netlify account. Everybody who signs up with a Bolt account ends up with a Supabase account, right? That's driving meaningful growth for those companies. And so if Bolt announced it was buying Supabase or Supabase, there's some transaction happened between those three companies, nobody would be surprised because everybody knows that they're tightly integrated and hugely interdependent. The other thing is because one competitor wants to do a deal one way doesn't mean that their direct competitor will be the same. Competitors can be very, very different companies, very different to work with, very different partners. So just because you tried it with one doesn't mean it isn't worth trying with another. And it's great if you can partner with all the companies that mean something in an industry. So you got your offer, you negotiate your LOI. Excuse me. How can things go wrong? I mentioned before, you took too high a valuation. This is probably the number one silent deal killer. That if you, let's say you raised 100 million from Andreessen at a 500 million valuation and you were in the cover of Forbes and everybody thought you were the best thing since sliced bread and this was great, and now your business is flat. Well, if your business is only worth 100 million, congrats, you get zero. You're not going to make a nickel. I mean, you'll make something, but you're really not going to make anything off that acquisition. That's a real thing. You were sort of flying high, got to 10 million in revenue or maybe 20 million in ARR. And then it was a competitive deal. They came in at 400 or 500 million, right? And then growth flattened. Maybe Trump did something, who knows? Your shrank from 20 to 15 or 15 to 10, right? And now a 10x multiple on a shrinking business is actually hard to get, but 10x would get you to 100 million, right? So it happens. It's really hard to get a deal done below that last valuation for all like it can be done for sure, but it's much harder than an up valuation. Acquirers, for the same reason the bankers might not take you on, some acquirers won't make an offer because we don't want to piss off the top VCs. We're going to have to take a loss or go through some pain, and we'd rather for the next one if it's not that important. If you waited too long and you don't have enough money in the bank to be to not have this fraudulent conveyance concern, that's a risk. I don't want to overplay this. It is a thing, but just don't wait too long, among many of the bad things that happens when you wait too long. If you don't disclose everything because your buyer is going to find it out. So if you have an employee lawsuit, if you have a founder lawsuit, whether it was settled or not, you need to disclose everything once you get to that confirmatory diligence phase. So getting an offer phase necessarily, although usually I think it's better to over disclose there because you come across as more honest. And the last thing you want is to pay lawyers a bunch of money to put together a data room for a company that walks away on day one. But definitely when you get into confirmatory diligence, just everything. An example, one company I worked with had a founder sue or threaten to sue right before an M&A process started, or actually it was kind of mid-process. They were like, what do we put in the data room? I was like, you put everything in the data room. And they were like, well, we should just put the letter in and, a statement from our lawyer that says it's no big deal. And I was like, yeah, and then what do you think is going to happen next? They're going to read that, they're going to freak out, they're going to ask you for everything on it. So you might as well just give them everything up front. So recognize that if you're running out of cash, if you have some skeleton in the closet, it is going to come out. And it's better to just be upfront about it. You're upfront about it, whether it's good news or bad news, always discuss it live. That way you're sure they heard and understood. You got credit for the good news. You were able to understand what the impact of the bad news was. You were able to answer questions. So always discuss key items live when you're in that. Well, through almost any stage, but especially, post LOI when you're trying to close the deal. Great way to kill a deal is to miss your numbers. I think a lot of startup founders, especially early stage startup founders, don't really appreciate this because they're used to VCs who don't believe their forecast anyway, which is true in the seed and A range. But the further along you get, the more people expect you to hit your forecast. Bankers, corp dev, finance, you don't miss your forecast during a M&A acquisition. I mean, it's fine to beat it, but don't miss it low, especially by a lot, because that'll kill. People will say, wait a minute, we're paying a 20x premium for growth here and they're shrinking or they're not growing as much as we thought, and they'll either retrade it or they'll just walk away. I think that it's easy to say, oh, it's a startup, it's hard to predict. Yeah, really, it means one of two things. Either you're not very good at predicting your business, or because you don't understand it, or for some other probably negative reason, or you're not very good at running your business and you miss your forecast. So neither of those things are things that companies want to write a big check to acquire. HR. It's so easy to get international hiring right today and local hiring. So easy. Why would you not? So don't hire US employees as contractors, right? If they're working 40 hours a week and you give them a laptop, make them employees. Don't hire people in foreign countries without using a platform to manage them and make sure that you're following the laws of that country. Just wiring the money or sending them money in some cash app is not the same as it's there are some countries there are some countries where it costs a lot of money to employ somebody on the level, and that's because it's important. So India, it costs, I think Deal and Rippling both charge $500 to $1,000 to manage an employee in India because that you need to manage an employee in India. So if you're just wiring money to your India contractor, that's super risky and it will cost you in an M&A process. It might not kill the deal, but it might slow it down. The acquirer is going to have to get local counsel. You might have to get local counsel. You might have to set aside $100,000 or $200,000 to fix that. And just it's extra noise. Why do it? Just do it right to begin with. Founder spats are this stuff comes up in M&A, right? Where one founder thought that they were building a unicorn and the other one's happy with 20 million bucks, right? And the unicorn founder tries to kill a deal during the process. There's so many different permutations of this. Really get on the same page as your co-founders. Time. So time kills deals. It's probably the all the other things that happen that extend a deal. You screwed up your into hiring, or you had a founder that sued you and you had to explain that, and that took a week, right? Any timing thing will kill a deal. I mean, famously, Monkey's CEO passed away during an M&A process. He's got a bunch of M&A processes. One of the people that was at the Tech Week event that I hosted, he was his deal was on the table, and when that CEO passed away, his deal died and he didn't get it back. Another friend of mine got his deal done. But things happen, people change, roles change, priorities change. So just don't let deals drag out, because if a deal drags out, it's just more likely that something goes wrong. So just to repeat it all, these are the deal killers. Try to avoid them. A bunch of them are very avoidable. And just be thoughtful and intentional as you build your company. So to sum up, same big ideas. Build a great business. That's the winning strategy. Build great partnerships. Those are going to be your best way to precipitate an inbound offer, to have confidence that going to that acquirer is something that you want to do. Take smart risks, whether that's in product or hiring or whatever, but avoid the dumb ones. And hopefully you'll be able to run a great process and get a great exit. So in terms of practical advice on who can help you. So your board can help you if they are experienced. So VCs don't actually do that many deals, and some of them have truly awful advice. So don't, just because they sold their company once 15 years ago, think that they know everything. They might think they know everything. They're like ChatGPT. They'll give you advice with all the confidence in the world, but it might be the wrong advice. So just be careful here. I mean, there are, again, some great VCs out there who have great advice. There are also many VCs, the majority of them have terrible advice. And also their interests don't align with yours, right? So I think that's true in a very practical and tactical and legal sense as well, right? You're going to end up with an offer that has some retention and some money that goes to the investors at any size. You may be diametrically opposed on some of those terms, right? They don't care if you have to rot away for 4 years to get their money. It's not their life that's being spent resting, investing. Your lawyers. So your lawyers are usually your best resource when it comes to standard deal terms, nitpicking, figuring out where to battle and where to give in. Lawyers are great because they see a lot of deals. They can't refer to them. They can't tell you who the deal was, but they know things. And lawyers are generally a great resource. And then bankers. Bankers or other advisors, somebody like me, can help you with the business terms and the more strategy stuff. So lawyers, most good lawyers won't give you a lot of advice on the business specific terms. That's where you have an agent like an advisor or a banker come in. Bankers do a lot more than that. And so they're definitely worth considering. They're definitely worth interviewing always. Usually the reason why somebody would go with an advisor instead of a banker is typically driven by either the bankers not being willing to take them, usually because the deal's too small, or the really high cost of bankers. So bankers drive a lot of value when they're marketing your company, when they're going out to get a lot of acquirers, then it's worth $1 million or more for their time. But if you did it right and you have these great partnerships and you're just running a process where 3 partners are in a bidding war over you, right? And you don't need more bidders, you just need to maximize your outcome amongst the people you already know. Bankers can sometimes scare people off a little bit. Bringing in an advisor to run that process and insulate you and your team from it and act as your agent can be more effective than and more cost effective than bringing in a full-on banking team. Bankers are great. I think if you've never sold a company before, don't stay at a Holiday Inn Express. This isn't when you learn on the job. It's better to get professional advice for your first time. So ways I can help. So like I said, I advise both on growing a great business and also getting acquired. Skip is a great resource for building a great business. A lot of people say email's dead. It isn't. I'm happy to talk to you about how Skip can help grow your business in a really cost-effective and efficient way. Then I post on LinkedIn a bunch. Please follow me. I'm easy to find on LinkedIn, usually about M&A, go-to-market, and startup strategy, and the occasional rant. Thank you guys for coming. If you have questions, I'm just Alex at skip.ai. Feel free to drop me a note. Would love to stay connected with all of you. Thanks for joining.